Good morning, this is Omni View, Episode 10, Balanced News Perspectives. Today is March 9th, 2026. We'll cover what happened, how different viewpoints frame it, so you can decide for yourself. Iran's new supreme leader vows escalated attacks as oil surges past $120 amid Gulf strikes. Let's start with the major leadership change in Iran that's sending ripples through the ongoing conflict. Iran has appointed Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the late Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, as the new supreme leader after his father's recent death, according to state media reports. Hardliners within the country are celebrating this move, with vows to ramp up missile attacks on infrastructure, and the regime has firmly ruled out any immediate ceasefire. There's also mention of Mojtaba sustaining some kind of mystery injury, though details from state TV remain unclear. Conservative outlets like those in the Mail Online frame this transition as a seamless continuation of hardline policies, emphasizing Mojtaba's alignment with his father's rejection of dissent and portraying it as a defiant stand against U.S. and Israeli aggression that bolsters Iran's resolve. International sources such as France 24 highlight concerns over stability, noting that Mojtaba wasn't on prior successor lists and suggesting this signals business as usual in Iran's pushback against Western influence, which could prolong the war. Centrist views weave in the broader geopolitical tensions, focusing on the uncertainty around those injury reports and pondering whether this change might escalate attacks or subtly open doors for negotiation, depending on global responses. One question worth considering here is how Mojtaba Khamenei's reported injury might affect his ability to lead effectively during an active war. Shifting now to the immediate fallout from Iran's actions in the region, where attacks are driving up global energy costs. Overnight, Iran launched drone and missile strikes on Gulf states, including a hit on a refinery in Bahrain that injured 32 people, the highest casualties there since the war started. This has pushed oil prices above $120 per barrel, shaking global markets and prompted the U.S. to order non-emergency staff to evacuate from Saudi Arabia as the conflict broadens, without any sign of a ceasefire. Right-leaning reports, as seen in the Mail Online, emphasize this as an aggressive escalation by Iran, praising U.S. leadership under President Trump for setting terms of defeat and viewing the rising energy costs as a necessary price for long-term security, while noting panic in the affected areas. International outlets like France 24 underscore the human toll, such as those injuries in Bahrain and the wider market disruptions, framing the situation as a regional crisis that hits Gulf stability and global energy supplies hardest. Centrist business perspectives from Bloomberg note the possibility of governments releasing oil reserves to ease price spikes, portraying this as an economic uncertainty that might lead to stock market recoveries but could also fuel prolonged inflation if the war drags on. A thoughtful question to ponder is how these continued attacks on Gulf infrastructure might lead to broader humanitarian consequences for the region. Meanwhile, in the U.S., bold statements from the Defense Secretary are adding another layer to the narrative around the war's endgame. U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has publicly guaranteed that Iran will surrender, with President Trump set to dictate the terms, all amid oil prices soaring past $100 per barrel due to the expanding conflict. Trump himself described the resulting increases in energy bills as a small price to pay for taming Iran, as global markets continue to react. Conservative sources, including reports from the Mail Online, portray Hegseth's guarantee as a sign of confident U.S. leadership, framing the war as a justified response to Iranian threats and downplaying the economic fallout as temporary in exchange for long-term gains against aggression. International views from France 24 express skepticism, pointing to Iran's refusal of a ceasefire and the broader human costs, while suggesting that such bold claims could either speed up a resolution or just prolong the stalemate. Centrist analyses in Bloomberg tie this to market volatility, noting how these oil surges affect even net exporters like the U.S., and discuss whether diplomatic pressures might align with these military assertions to actually end the conflict. Something to consider is how reliable these kinds of public guarantees from officials really are during active conflicts. Next, a stark warning from the Kremlin is injecting even more tension into the global conversation about this war. The Kremlin has issued a dramatic statement warning that the end of the world is upon us in connection to the escalating conflict involving Iran, as the war disrupts global energy markets and pulls in international players. Details on what exactly triggered this warning are vague in the reports, but it comes amid widespread involvement and market instability. Russian-aligned views amplify this apocalyptic tone, framing the war as a catastrophic provocation by the West that risks global disaster and calling for de-escalation to prevent broader involvement. International outlets like France 24 treat it as hyperbolic rhetoric, linking it to oil disruptions and suggesting it reflects Moscow's real concerns over energy security rather than a literal prediction of doom. Centrist perspectives from Bloomberg see this as strategic posturing, possibly aimed at influencing negotiations or underscoring how the conflict could spill over into places like Europe. One question this raises is what strategic goals might be underlying such dramatic warnings from the Kremlin. Turning to the human cost on the ground, let's look at the situation in Lebanon, where Israeli strikes are causing massive displacement. Intensifying Israeli strikes targeting areas linked to Hezbollah have displaced around 500,000 people in Lebanon, with Lebanese authorities reporting nearly 400 deaths just in the past week. An airstrike recently hit Beirut's southern suburbs after warnings about a firm connected to the group, adding to the chaos. Middle Eastern sources, as covered in France 24, emphasize the humanitarian crisis, portraying these displacements as a severe consequence of Israeli aggression that worsens regional suffering and calls for international intervention. Western views often frame the strikes as defensive measures against Hezbollah threats in the context of the wider war with Iran, stressing the importance of precision to minimize civilian harm. International perspectives balance this by noting daily disruptions like air raid sirens and even divided opinions within Israel itself on expanding the war, suggesting questions about its long-term viability. A key question here is how effective those warnings before strikes really are in reducing civilian casualties. Staying in the region, Israelis themselves are showing divisions over how this war is unfolding. Air raid sirens have become a routine part of life in Israel due to Iranian missile launches, with residents adapting by seeking shelter quickly, though outdoor activities continue in a show of resilience. In places like Jerusalem, opinions vary widely on the war's conduct and whether it should expand further. Local Israeli coverage, as reported in France 24, reflects this split. Some see the war as essential for security against Iranian threats and praise the military responses, while others question its prolongation and the human costs, pushing for diplomatic alternatives. International outlets amplify these divisions, framing them as signs of broader fatigue in prolonged conflicts and suggesting that public sentiment could pressure leaders toward de-escalation. Centrist views integrate the global context, noting how the war's spread affects allies and economies, which might shift opinions toward seeking a balanced resolution. What's interesting to think about is how these daily air raids might impact long-term public morale in conflict zones. On a different note, amid all this geopolitical tension, a protest by Iran's women's football team is highlighting internal dissent. During an Asian Cup match against South Korea, Iran's women's football team stood silent through the national anthem, which led to them being branded traitors by the regime. Afterward, they signaled SOS from their bus, drawing supportive chants from the crowd and sparking a furious response from authorities. Progressive international sources like those in the Mail Online celebrate this as a brave stand for women's rights and against oppression, linking it to wider dissent in Iran during the war. Conservative outlets in the region criticize it as disloyalty at a time of national crisis, framing it as something that undermines unity against external threats. Centrist views from France 24 contextualize it within global sports activism, noting how these gestures can amplify calls for change but also carry severe risks under the new hardline leadership. One question this prompts is what risks athletes face when protesting in authoritarian regimes. Before we go, tomorrow, watch for updates on whether FIFA decides to postpone Iraq's World Cup playoff amid the war's disruptions. That's Omni View. For full source links and more context, check out today's written briefing on the Omni View summaries page. As always, compare outlets, look for primary documents, and separate what's known from what's assumed. If balanced perspectives are valuable to you, share this with a friend and subscribe wherever you listen. See you tomorrow.
Without taking the dive, we went on vacation. We had a nice time. My doomsday